Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. He's Mike Niziolek, Bloomington Herald Times. It is a lovely, temperate Thursday afternoon in Mike, you're in Central Indiana, so I can't say Southern Indiana. We gotta pull you a little closer. Need you to move to like
You're
Martinsville,
like 25 minutes south of Bloomington, where I'm just 25 minutes north. So we got to
Monrovia.
meet in the middle.
My address still says Bloomington, so I'm not sure you're going to win that particular argument.
On the outskirts of Bloomington. That's where you are.
I do live on the outskirts. There's no question about that. This is Mind Your Banners for Thursday, September 4th, 2025, and we will be talking IU football. Before we do, as ever, please, if you're watching this on YouTube or you're watching the replay show on YouTube, please like and subscribe. The YouTube channel that has been getting a ton of extra traffic lately, a ton of extra engagement. We have been trying to feed that more and more, and we will continue to, where we're developing all the time a more sort of expanded content plans there. So please like and subscribe at Indy Star TV Hoosiers. Mike, let's talk football. Indiana, Old Dominion, Indiana 27, Old Dominion 14. I mean, let's start where this is, frankly, just simplest. What, in the sort of cold light of several days after the game is over, what sticks with you? What is kind of what is still rattling around in your brain from Saturday?
Not much. That game had very little juice, and the game this weekend even has less juice.
Return of Dexter Williams. Read all about it tomorrow at indystar.com/sports.
It feels all like preseason, honestly, that we're all leading up to the Illinois game, and that they're working out the kinks, and this is sort of a ramp up. And I mean, I think that they're lucky in the fact that those red zone struggles didn't come against a Power 4 opponent, because that could have really come back and bit them. Like, they're down 11 seconds into the game briefly, but they never felt like they were going to lose that game. They had more talent. The offense, like Kurt Signetti said, looked good for about 93 yards, but struggled, to get that extra little bit. And the defense really botched 2 plays. But it all just felt like they had to work some things out, and they'll kind of get it right here over the next. Got 2 more games to get it right, and then the real stuff starts.
Do you think so? There were a couple interesting sort of threads that I thought Signetti pulled on Monday during his news conference. One was he seemed a little bit kind of at war with himself, because he kept sort of trying to find that balance a coach wants to find after a game like this, and these games do happen, where he was saying it wasn't good enough, but I'm not worried. Almost was kind of the first sort of vibe I got was it wasn't good enough. No one thinks it was good enough, but we're going to get better, and what's there is fixable. Do you think that's a fair sort of casting of his comments? Saturday is different, but Monday, when he's had a chance to look at the film, talk to his staff, etc.
Well, I think when you looked under the hood of the game, there were a lot of good things, right? Like you mentioned, he rattled off a bunch of stats. Look, they won the turnover battle 3-1. I think you mentioned time of possession was what? 3-1 or 2-1,
like 41 or 42 to 18, 19. Yeah.
Penalties, they had 3 for 25, but he said he kind of discounted 2 of them that they weren't good calls. I mean, one true penalty. These are things you're going to take and put in a win column. They did run for over 300 yards. And so I think his point was you can't sort of just point out the mistakes and make that overshadow the good you did, when a lot of it was good, right? I mean, you can't fault some team. The 300 rushing yards, I think, was only the second time I think that Indiana football tweeted this since 2014. They've accomplished that. So I mean, and the running backs looked really good. BB has the fumble, and then like we've talked about the kind of the goal line struggles. But I mean, you'll take that most days, most games. And so I think it was sort of, I don't know if it was at war with himself, but I just think it was trying to balance it and temper it. Like, last year he did that at times, like where he'd worry about something, but he didn't want it to like overshadow or kind of dictate how he coached. Like, there was good in that game.
I thought, and this is, I mean, I am admittedly soccer brained compared to most people, but like advanced sort of statistics and analytics are relatively new in soccer. like compared to a sport like basketball or even like football, certainly baseball. And because soccer is such a small outcome sport, like at the end of the day, the game is decided by a very small handful of goals most of the time. What I think a lot of people have come to use analytics for is a little bit less sort of like, um, a little bit less sort of assessment and a little bit more prediction. And what I mean by that is sort of, okay, at the end of the day, we know that there's only a small handful, like a small handful of moments are going to decide this game one way or the other. But what do all the underlying numbers tell us about which team is creating better chances, which team is making more of the possession that they have, who's playing where, and when they're there, is it working well, and that kind of thing. And obviously, we're not talking in advanced statistics when we say things like 509 total yards of offense, but it did feel a little bit like a game where the underlying numbers that reflect the process, to your point about penalties, about the turnover battle, about the way the Indiana ran the ball, the way they moved the ball until they got into scoring situations, doesn't really reflect the final score. And I think, maybe if this was a less experienced team, and I know that there's a lot of new faces in terms of portal ads, but maybe if this was a less experienced team, Signetti might be a little bit less, or a little bit more wary of like potential warning signs from something like this. But I just wonder if he looks at that box score and he says, if we played this game with these numbers 100 times, that final score is on the low end of sort of the variance spectrum. We win this by at least a couple more touchdowns almost all the time.
Yeah, well, I think he listed some scores that he thought, 52-7 was one that he said the game probably was closer to in terms of what it should have been. He said they had left, nearly 35 points on the board. So, I mean, I do think that, he had that sort of a view of things that, look, they're not going to, on 6 trips inside the 10, they're not going to not get touchdowns 4 times very often. But I think why those things stood out was because of the success they had last year and how much the 55 touchdowns in the red zone. Only didn't score 5 times on 5. I think it was 64-69 overall. And Curtis Rourke, and maybe this kind of transitions into the Mendoza of it all. That was really his strength, and like he was just fantastic inside the 20-yard line and rarely missed. And as much as we kind of focus on the run game struggles, Mendoza was not very good inside the 20 at all. I mean, he didn't complete a pass, and probably should have had 2 touchdown throws. And so I just think it was in start. If you're comparing this year's team to last year's team, that's why that stood out so much, because they rarely got inside the 20 last year and didn't have a perfect. And Curtis and I talked about the plan he wasn't very happy with. There was rarely a moment where they didn't look locked in inside the 20, regardless of if they were struggling or not.
Yeah, I mean, and we can kind of move into the Fernando Mendoza sort of debut more widely here. I know why you bring up Mendoza versus Rourke, and it's worth saying, like, Indiana, Kurt Zignetti said this was a little bit like Groundhog Day to the FIU game. Of course, I think the difference for him there was Indiana was actually very good in the red zone specifically that day. It was that Indiana just kind of stopped functioning offensively for about 2 quarters. They scored touchdowns on 3 straight drives in like the first and early second quarter of that game. And then I think they had a field goal over the next like 30 something minutes of football. And it was sort of this feeling of like, well, if it was working so well, why did Indiana just lose the thread so easily, so quickly? With this game, it's a little bit different in the sense that you felt like the offense was operating really well. I mean, the defense was 2. There's 2 big busts, but other than that, as you talk about, 3 turnovers, 10 pressures on 24 dropbacks. Old Dominion doesn't take a snap on the plus side of the 50 the entire afternoon. The process is working. It's the result that's lacking. And I know there's some sort of discussion of Fernando Mendoza, and I understand why. I do think one thing that Indiana, at least as I think back on it now, and I'm not going to pretend that I've watched a ton of Curtis Rourke red zone film from 2024 in the last like 2 days. But Indiana did a really good job of keeping defenses off balance in the red zone because they ran the ball well in small space and short yardage situations. And I think that some of the red zone struggles for Indiana probably really start when they get down to the 1 yard line and they go boom, 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 and can't get the ball in the end zone on the ground in 3 straight tries. Was it maybe it was 4 straight tries? I don't remember what they did on 4th down. But the point is, I think part of what made Rourke so successful in the red zone was that teams could not key in on the pass at any given time because they knew that Indiana was going to be effective running the ball even in a compressed field. I felt like Indiana, I'm not absolving Mendoza of blame, but I do feel like Indiana probably put Mendoza in some less favorable situations. It's hard to throw the ball when the field shrinks like that. And I think a lot of the times that it felt like Indiana had Mendoza throwing the ball inside the 20 and certainly inside the 10 were moments where you sort of said, okay, Indiana's probably got to throw here because the run game is not functioning well enough in this tight space. But then that means a defense can probably anticipate the pass a little bit more than what I think it was able to do with Rourke consistently last season.
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily, because the 2 throws that he missed that were touchdowns, he had single coverage and it was fade balls that he misplaced and he wasn't getting pressured, and it really wasn't that. And those were the passes I think specifically Rourke rarely missed on. Placed a really good ball, on those routes. And so, I mean, you could say, yeah, look, nobody gets a pass, right, in the red zone, and even the offensive line. Pat Coogan was talking about, we got to take that one on the chin. Like, doesn't matter what the scheme was, and the 3-3-5 presents some unique problems. Like, if you need a yard, you need to get a yard. It doesn't. Nothing else matters. So I don't think anybody gets a pass. I think with Mendoza specifically, some of the problems were more that he just didn't make good throws and wasn't making. And Kurt's going to reference this again on Monday. Maybe this wasn't specific to the red zone, but some of the reads he was making weren't great. That he wasn't, getting through his progressions quick enough, and that's been sort of a problem even going back to the spring. That's what they've worked on with. So I don't think anybody gets a pass, and I think some of those throws were just more the chemistry is sort of a work in progress, maybe with Mendoza and the receivers more so than we thought it maybe would be, because Omar Cooper had a drop. He overthrew LeBron Bond on a sure touchdown. And so there was a lot to sort of pick apart, I think, with the passing game. And it stands out because in 20 career starts, that was only the 4th time he's completed less than 60% of his passes. This was his strength, being able to get the ball to guys. And that just wasn't the case on Saturday.
I think if we look at Mendoza's just sort of day more widely, 18 to 31, 193 yards, no touchdowns. He has the 1 rushing touchdown. Probably a small handful of throws that you think he got away with, but I don't know how often he was that close to throwing like really bad triple coverage that should have been picked off. It just, like, to me, you mentioned, and Cignetti mentioned this too, read progressions, and I think that has gone hand in hand in Cignetti's mind with trusting his protection, because, and we've talked about this, going back to the spring last year, the reality is there were probably a lot of times at Cal where he didn't have more than 2 reads when he dropped back because he knew that he wouldn't get time for more than 2 reads. That it wasn't necessarily that he was a 1 or 2 read quarterback. It was that Cal's offensive line just could not block long enough and effectively enough for a quarterback to be able to go through 3 or 4 progressions, or to check back, to start on one side of the field, go to the other, and then check back to the first one, that kind of thing. I think those 2 things go hand in hand, because a lot of that, you mentioned chemistry with receivers, but I think a lot of that is also about timing. And a lot of that is a quarterback's internal timing of, without sitting there in the pocket and thinking 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And obviously, if you're doing that, you're not thinking about what's going on in front of you. Being able to sort of subconsciously keep his timing and therefore his rhythm in the pocket. And I just thought, like, he had a couple throws, the Cooper drop was one of them. He had a couple throws where you thought, okay, that's the combination of sort of poison arm talent that has people talking about him as a draft prospect. I thought he just had a number of moments too. And maybe it's chemistry, like you talk about with his receivers that, I mean, like, for example, he's all over EJ Williams early, but he doesn't hit Elijah Surratt and it didn't even target him until the second half. So maybe some of that is just relationship and chemistry and what he's comfortable with. Some of it is probably to a certain extent play calling. I think everyone can acknowledge that's going to be the case in week one against a Sun Belt opponent. And some of it does feel like just that sort of internal rhythm and confidence that he's got to have that, again, I don't know that I would necessarily say Rourke had immediately in week one. And it's last season's beginning kind of gets skewed a little bit by just how easy the Western Illinois game is. And we'll see what these two games upcoming look like for Indiana. But the point is Rourke has it by UCLA. Like that's what matters. Rourke is only 15 to 24 against FIU. He's got one touchdown pass. I think he throws for about 180 yards, 184, I think. He puts up great numbers against Western Illinois, but I think I had 2 touchdowns against Western Illinois. Like, it's not, that, well, I mean, I got loose on one, and then the other one was just kind of it was a fade route, goal line. But, that game is kind of its own thing in a lot of respects. But the point is Rourke is ready by UCLA. And I think if you're Indiana, you're okay with some of these issues of like timing and rhythm as long as you feel like they're gone by the time you get, I would say, probably to the other side of this weekend, because, I think Kennesaw State is going to try and do some stuff creatively, defensively. Obviously, I don't think Wake Forest is as good as Indiana is offensively, but they did hold Wake Forest to 10 points at home last weekend. So they're probably not just a pushover. And I don't think you're going to learn anything against Indiana State that you didn't already learn against Old Dominion and Kennesaw State. And so I feel like there's a little bit of, if Indiana gets to the other side of Kennesaw State and Mendoza's look better, that's when I think you maybe feel like, all right, he knocked a little rust off and he got a little, he's going to be ready for Illinois in the same way that Rourke was ready for UCLA. That's the question I think I would ask now.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair because, I mean, the Indiana State game, I mean, the hope is that he only has to play even half, if that. You want to get that game done and get everybody else in. So, I mean, this is your sort of, moment to kind of clean things up and to put, I think, especially with the red zone offense, put those struggles behind you, and sort of, I don't know, feel good about everything, kind of like you said, as you target that Illinois game.
Your guy AJ Williams had a really big day.
Well, he had a big first half.
Well, but I mean, it was a big day. Come on. I mean, one of us picked the over on, what was it, 24 and a half catches?
4.5, yeah.
So I mean, we're on track to see it to see that record fall before Indiana even gets off the plane in Eugene. I mean, I'm feeling good about where I'm going. Let's talk about an area that I think unquestionably Indiana really had success, and maybe to your point, had more success than, I don't want to say we expected, because I think you knew that the ground game, like the offensive line, was plenty experienced on paper. We both liked, the addition of Roman Hemby. We both thought, I think, that Kaelon Black was going to take a step forward for Indiana this season. You mentioned Lee Beebe as well, but you also mentioned it's been a long time since Indiana against anybody put up that kind of rushing performance. And I think, in particular for me, it was like last season, I thought Indiana had a really commendably functional rushing attack. And what I mean by that is, like, guys were falling forward, lots of 4 and 5 yards. You always felt like you were staying on schedule. You could count on them in long, in short yardage, not long yardage, short yardage situations and so forth. But I mean, like, Indiana had, and I recognize it's a small sample size. I know who they played. Let's also acknowledge a bunch of other teams didn't play that many, not that many Big Ten teams played a particularly strong opponent in week one either. Indiana had the second most rushes at 10 plus yards in the Big Ten last weekend. And the only team ahead of them was Washington, which obviously has, I would argue, the best running back in the Big Ten in Jonah Coleman. So, like, Indiana was one of, I'm looking at the numbers here, one of only 2 teams. Michigan was the other to have 2 runs of 30 plus yards. Like, there's an explosivity in that group. And we can look at a Roman Hemby and we could say, well, yeah, he was explosive at Maryland. But when the scheme is producing the explosiveness, I think that is what sort of surprised me. And again, maybe some of that is running the ball to stay vanilla, to not put too much on film. I mean, at a certain point, you do need to start putting pulling some of that stuff out of the bag because you need to work on it. You just need to practice it in a live game setting before you get to an Illinois or certainly an Iowa. But I mean, what was striking to me wasn't just the raw number for Indiana; it was how many explosive plays they got along the way, because that was a dynamic that, if you look at last year, it was I would say something of a strength again in like keeping the offense on schedule. Indiana was kind of middle of the road when you started talking about like 20 plus yard runs, 30 plus yard runs in the Big Ten. If this team has the capacity to be more explosive on the ground, I think that changes the calculus of how for at least the first like 5 or 6 weeks, teams are really going to be able to prepare for this group offensively.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, kind of some of the numbers under the hood in terms of, they combined for 15 forced missed tackles. That was more than they had in any single game. I mean, so you can kind of see like the running backs were certainly doing their part to get extra yardage. I think it was like around 150 yards after contact. Roman Hemby had 8 forced missed tackles. That was tied a career high.
Ground game got those page views.
Yeah, contact.
All that after content.
And just, the volume of carries, I think that was, he had 23 or 24. That was the second most in a single game for a running back under Cignetti. Only Justice Ellison had 1 20-yard carry last year, and no other running back had one. And so just a very different game than a lot of the ones that they had played last year. They just, they still spread the ball around and still had 3 backs carrying the ball, but Hemby obviously got a heavier workload, especially when they went away to BB for about 2 quarters after he fumbled. He did not get a touch for a little while.
I mean, that's something the coaches do. Like if you fumble the ball, it tends to be expected that like you're going to come out for a minute. Yeah.
Yeah, but still, Hemby got a heavier workload than I think we've seen. And I thought, I know he said he wants to keep keep spreading out the carries, but if Hemby carries the ball like that, does he sort of elevate himself a little ahead of the pack?
I mean, I don't see how he can't. If you know what I'm saying. And listen, I mean, the other thing I would say about Hemby is Roman Hemby's the only one of the 3 that he has an obvious experiential leg up, which is that he has been a full-time starting Big Ten running back for at least the last 2 years. I mean, he was involved at Maryland for 3 years, and he's been, he was RB1 for probably at least the bulk of the last 2 years. And I know that like Maryland throws the ball a lot, so it's a little bit of a different, it's not like he was getting 38 carries a game, but while Kalon Black has the experience that he has in the IU system with the IU staff, Hemby has the experience in the conference. And so like if he puts up those numbers, I mean, I think he had both of the explosive runs. Am I right in saying that?
No, Kalon and him each had 130.
Okay. But just like for reference, Indiana had, again, 2 rushes of 30-plus yards on Saturday. They only had 5 all of last season across 13 games. So, like, that kind of explosivity. And it's not like, I mean, the team that led the Big Ten in 30-plus yard rushes.
Explosiveness, not explosivity? Like, that, that's such a weird...
Explosive. I don't know. I've heard people use it. Maybe it's just one of the words that we made up.
Exclusivity, but I've never heard
explosivity. Well, you know what? That's the name. That's the new name of the podcast.
There you go.
Mind your explosivity. And the Big Ten will be minding Roman Hemby's explosivity starting in week 4. No, I mean, like I don't want these numbers to I don't want to sound like I'm exaggerating these numbers. Like the team that led the Big Ten last year was Iowa with 15 runs of 30-plus yards. It's not like it happens a ton. But it's more the idea that every year an offense needs to evolve, and especially in the portal era, every year an offense kind of is going to be required to evolve just by the fact that players will come and go. We have been asking all offseason about potential evolutions for this offense, a lot of them centered around justifiably the quarterback situation and Fernando Mendoza and what would look different between him and Curtis Rourke. But I also think we got an answer to a question we have asked a lot this offseason too, or at least the beginnings of an answer, obviously, insofar as what does this look like when you have maybe a stable of running backs that, and I don't want to damn last year's backs with faint praise. It's a different group. It's not better or worse. It's just maybe a slightly different skill set. when you have a group that goes from sort of that workman-like, we're going to grind you down, we're hard to tackle, we're always falling forward, we're always gaining yards, we're always putting ourselves in more favorable down and distance situations, to a group that might have a little bit more burst when the hole opens up.
But if they leave 24 points on the board in the red zone again, or 21 points on the board, Curt Cignetti might say, "Give me the backs from get Justin Ellis in a uniform," and he's no longer a volunteer or assistant coach.
A COVID year, an extra COVID year.
What is eligible? Like we sue somebody to get that. And so but it is tough though, because yes, I agree with your point that was not a strength of last year's group. That 10 plus yards runs, 30 plus yards run. Like, I mean, it was more the idea, like if you needed a yard or you needed to fall forward, short yard situations, they were as reliable as there was out there. And they did miss that. They did miss that element on Saturday. So can they scheme up a better plan to sort of take advantage of this group's skill set inside the one, where you're not just, because I think almost all those runs at the 1 yard line were like between the tackles. Right?
One was, I think, designed to bounce out and
didn't. It
the
edge,
basically. Yeah.
Mendoza went outside, but in terms of the running back, like, and that might not be their strength, right? Like, so, because Tyson Lawton was just kind of like a bulldog down there. Like, he scored 12 touchdowns. So, it's just like, that's what they did. And so maybe it's sort of now matching what you have to that different skill set. Because I do think they need to make some improvements there, or 300 yards is not going to look as impressive if, 6 times a game you're at the 1 yard line, you can't score.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it goes without saying, if you're at the 1, you just got to find a way to score. That could also be one where if you have a slightly different group of skills, or sort of like set of skills among your players back there, you could be holding some things back. I don't know how much you'd really be holding back at the 1. Like, I don't think Indiana's got a bunch of clever play calls that they're going to run. A moment
where Riley Nowitzki gets a former fullback that they put him in, and bulldoze, but they're saving that for
But I think I can see a world where some of the red zone stuff is like Indiana didn't even look like attempting a wide receiver screen, which they had a lot of success with in the red zone last season, in and around the red zone. So, it's possible some stuff's getting held back. Somebody here asked about Byron Baldwin, and I think this is as John says, anyone know what the injury is to Byron Baldwin? It is not public, other than Curt Cignetti has said it's day to day. Now, does that mean he's available for this weekend? We had this conversation, and we should probably just refresh people on where Lewis Moore is as well, not just because of safety, but because just for like injury purposes. Bryson Bonds is out for the season. I think that obviously hurts your depth at safety, as you pointed out earlier this week. That hurts your depth maybe even more in special teams, where Bonds had been a really consistent player for Indiana the last couple of years. Byron Baldwin again remains day to day. We saw a lot of Lewis Moore on Saturday, as we talked about last week. It's this weird balancing act of how much do you rely on Moore if you're unsure if you're going to have him for the whole season. So I guess after offering that injury update as much as we can, let's sort of refresh on the Lewis Moore situation, because he is eligible for this weekend. I think it's important to underline one more time, Indiana's not going to be penalized for playing him if he later loses his eligibility. He's eligible until he isn't. So it's not like Indiana's risking having to forfeit these games somewhere down the line. That is, per my understanding, not at all in play. Where kind of are things with Lewis Moore? Maybe not necessarily going into this weekend, but certainly coming out of this weekend.
Yeah, this weekend's the same as it was last week. He'll be eligible, and you mentioned played a lot. Indiana didn't rotate anybody in the secondary. All 5 starters played all 46 snaps. So it was the same group from the start to the finish. And then he'll have a hearing September 10th. I believe that's at 9 a.m. Central in Dallas County, basically to go over this motion. And if Moore were to win the motion, because the NCAA has filed to dismiss the case, then they'd go into a hearing about kind of the injunction that he needs to kind of continue playing. If the NCAA wins the motion, the case is dismissed. Basically, he would have to he would have the option to refile in Indiana, but then he would need to go and get another temporary restraining order and it'd probably be weeks out before anything would come to. I think it'd be just a. I don't know that there'd be a way forward if he loses on Wednesday, and he needs that extra injunction to stay eligible, stay on the field for the rest of the 2025 season. And the judge hinted at that he extended the temporary restraining order for 14 days, and I believe he said he hinted that that's really all you're allowed to do, and he wasn't comfortable doing it again. And so it's kind of make or break, I think, here on Wednesday, obviously barring some unforeseen developments. And so that puts them in a spot. Like we talked about, Bonds didn't play a ton of defense the last 5 years, but was available and knew the system now. I mean, having been with this team for since last year. And so I think he gave you just some insurance. And, if Baldwin can get healthy, that helps. But man, if Moore were to lose and not be eligible, safety is definitely a spot to watch in terms of just sheer numbers and having to stay healthy then the rest of the season once Baldwin gets back.
I mean, I think you'd have to. I don't know if anybody got a chance to ask Curt Cignetti about this, but I think you would have to consider repurposing somebody.
Oh yeah, I'd imagine
corner
cross-training
rover.
somebody from
Yeah.
corner at safety, and I guess we'll get a look at it. When they do the 11-on-11 kind of in the pregame, we'll get to see a couple of the guys they have as backups if anybody moved.
The other thing you could, in theory, do, because Boykin was playing at rover, in theory, you could reimagine the rover position, I suppose. I mean, like is more of like a true nickel type, bump. I mean, listen,
Or
they
do have a 4-3. They have 4-3 looks in there with one less safety on the field. I mean,
but you're probably going to have 5 defensive backs on the field more often than not in the college game. So, I guess my point is it might be a question of just what is more efficient. Like cross training a corner at safety, maybe somebody who's played it in the past, but you thought actually this would be their better position in college or whatever, or would it be taking Boykin, who's played safety in across I think a lot of, if not all of his career in college, moving him to the back end and reimagining, that rover spot with, again, somebody that is more of like a true corner, like a Rylan Gandy or an Amarian Knighton, or maybe it's a spot for a young player. I don't know.
Farrell mentioned that Baldwin was working at rover, so I'd imagine that if Moore were to lose his eligibility, that Boykin would be safety and Baldwin, in theory, would be rover. That would be my guess.
The Marcelino Ball position. True freshman. There you go. I don't know. That's all I got. Kennesaw State this weekend. I mean, a few interesting things. Just for me personally, it's been wild to see how quickly Kennesaw State has built up. I mean, they were an NAIA school when I was a kid. They were a Division II school until I think 16 years ago. They only got to the FBS, I think, 3 years ago. And how quickly that. I mean, they didn't even have football until I think within about the last 10 years. So how quickly that has moved from, just very. I mean, something. It would be sort of like if IUPUI was playing in the MAC, like that, that's their IU Indy, whatever we call it now. That's kind of what we're talking about. Kennesaw State, I think, is a little bit bigger school, but certainly in its history was never trying to have the scope in athletics that it does now. They play in Conference USA, as we mentioned earlier. They are they pushed Wake Forest all the way to the end. Last weekend, Curt Cignetti described their offense as warp speed when they want to go that fast. He sort of suggested they won't do it all the time, but they will try to do it as a change of pace to convince, to sort of throw you off your game. Of course, one of the talking points will be the return of Dexter Williams. I talked to Dexter on Wednesday night. We got a story coming out first thing Friday morning at indystar.com/sports, just talking with him about coming back to Bloomington. Indiana fans will be familiar with his skill set, bit of a dual threat, strong arm, has at times struggled for accuracy throughout his career. I suspect this team isn't as good as Old Dominion, but I also suspect this is going to be a team that, especially after last weekend, is maybe going to be feeling like, hey, we don't have a lot to lose, and we came real close to upsetting one Power 4 team on the road. Who's to say we can't, put the fear of God into somebody else?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that, but I watched a little bit of that, and I did watch kind of they had 2 drives that were like 10 plays, 70 plus that lasted just over 3 minutes. And so, I mean, their no huddle was legitimate. Like, I mean, get up and sprint to the line of scrimmage. And you know, I think the big thing that one thing you didn't mention, the I think the biggest impact of that is you don't get to sub as a defense. So, I mean, you've got to be ready for the next play. You're not coming out, and you got to line up and get everything right. You know, the benefit of having a guy at middle linebacker like Aiden Fisher that can get those things right, that'll help. And an experienced guy like Farrell on the back end to sort of get that group settled. But they did go, you know, when they wanted to, and it was a spread offense too. So it kind of spread you out, no huddle, and some fast looks. And the other thing that I looked at, kind of was looking at the stats, they did generate a decent amount of pressure. They played 12 defensive linemen, and 11 of those played more than 10 snaps. So we're really rotating a lot of guys to stay fresh. I think had a pressured Wake Forest quarterback 11 or 12 times. So it did generate a good deal of pressure. So could be an interesting, you know, can the offensive line, the pass blocking was pretty excellent against Old Dominion. Will that hold up on Saturday? It might be a little more of a challenge.
I think, I mean, one thing that when you mentioned, and we talked about this, and it is distinctive and notable how much Indiana used its starters, especially on defense, how little it rotated on that side of the ball. I think that is mitigated a little bit by the fact that Old Dominion has 45 snaps.
Yeah,
I think across the course of the game, that's a very low number, even in a game that's meant to be one-sided. You know, I'm looking at the drive chart, like they only had 2 drives last more than 5 plays. So I mean, and they only had 2 drives that lasted more than 3 minutes of game time. So there is an element, I think, sometimes if you're a team like Indiana, that, listen, we know they have some depth issues, but we also remarked throughout last season, Kurt Cignetti doesn't sub a ton. I mean, there are positions that rotate. Defensive line, I think, got that way a little bit last year. I think, obviously, you had wide receiver. Even on Saturday, you saw running in and out, running back, running in and out. We saw a fair bit of rotation at tight end. But there are spots on the field, and I think last year both the secondary and the linebacker group were among them, where Indiana kept a pretty tight group. They might have one sub, and like even Elijah Hardy is as maybe as memorable as some of his moments were last season. A lot of those moments came in garbage time, and I'm not like he was showcasing his promise. I'm not taking anything away from him, but it wasn't like Indiana was playing a ton of just running number 2s in and out all the time. If you can keep a team like Kennesaw State off the field, then you don't have to worry about warp speed offense. You don't have to worry about not being able to sub. You don't have to worry about maybe wearing down physically or mentally. And I think that's something that, like, I just would have been fascinated to know if Old Dominion took maybe 50 more or 15 more snaps
50
on
more
Saturday.
snaps.
50 more snaps. Boy, what a game that would have been. Imagine taking 95 snaps and scoring 14 points. But if Old Dominion had taken maybe 12 to 15 more snaps, if there would have been any more noticeable rotation, because I think if you're Indiana, you might look at these games and say, we can play our first team defense, kind of as much as we want, because ultimately, as long as we're doing things right, that's not going to be very much.
In terms of they'll be able to get
in terms of just like raw snap counts, like at the end of the day, I mean, you talk about, again, like them not rotating, but I mean, a normal snap count, like a Big Ten game, is what, like 65, 70 total snaps. I mean, like that's, it's 45 snaps is a really, really low number. And so while it's like, okay, Indiana didn't rotate at all defensively, that was probably in part because they just didn't feel like they needed to, because guys weren't getting tired. And when you talk about facing, and I used to see this when, Kevin Wilson, especially early on in his time at IU, was, just incredibly fast paced. It was all about speed and high tempo. And that was one of the reasons why he did it, was to try and wear opposing defenses down, to try and prevent subbing and mitigate maybe some of the depth advantages that better teams in the Big Ten had. But then what you'd run into is if Indiana was playing a team that did its job right defensively, Indiana just never had the ball. And so you never got a chance to wear that defense out because you were constantly just sending them back to the sideline after 3 or 4 snaps. If Indiana can have another game like that, I wouldn't be shocked if we don't see, a ton of rotation until maybe. I think what would be ideal for Curt Cignetti is to get up to a place where it's 41-7 after the third quarter or something like that, and he feels comfortable running in some of that second group that might be needed down the line.
Yeah, and I think the goal is to get ahead, especially obviously against Indiana State, but in terms of this Kennesaw State game, to try to get the backups. If you can't get them snaps in the first half when the games are credible because you don't want to, you don't need to give them that second half to get those reps. Because you mentioned Hardy, that those moments were important to him to sort of set him up for the rest of the season. Do you have a guy like that, a younger guy like that, that's capable of that? I mean, we've talked a lot about Baldwin, but anybody else in terms of getting some of that work in these next 2 weeks, I do think it's an important thing. Ryan asked about Kamara. I think he's not the only one. I mean, people have kind of commented and just about the defensive line in general. But I mean, I think Zach mentioned they pressured him on 10 of 24 drop back. I mean, they didn't pass very much. And when they did, he was under pressure half the time. I don't think Kamara had a standout game by any means, but it wasn't a game where any of the defensive linemen had sort of a dominant performance or had the ability to dominate the game just because of the way it was structured and their focus on having a mobile quarterback. It just wasn't that kind of game. Certainly Kamara didn't stand out, but I don't think it's necessarily a concern just based on who they were playing and the game plan that they had.
Well, and to your point again, only 24 dropbacks. That's a low number. I mean, it didn't feel like Indiana was throwing the ball that much with Fernando Mendoza, and yet Mendoza still attempts, I think, 31 passes, has 31 dropbacks. Like in this game, you're only crediting Old Dominion with 24 dropbacks. As you talk about, when it's a mobile quarterback, there's already going to be a bit more of a design of the pocket's going to move. There's always going to be a route out of the pocket. I think probably, in film study this week, of course they're going to be hammering on those 2 plays, but there's probably going to be more just emphasis in general on sort of structure or scheme-wide assignment football and what everyone was getting wrong when it broke down, because I don't think this was a game where you were going to see a ton of sack numbers rack up for anybody, frankly. And again, I mean, 10 of 24 dropbacks pressured, that's better than 40%. That's a good number. That's not like oh my God, I cannot believe, just how overwhelming Indiana was defensively in the pass rush, but that's a good number. And it's a good number, especially when
Hosa was the only defensive lineman with multiple pressures. The only other person that had multiple pressures was Aiden Fisher. So obviously, either things broke down or he blitzed. So, I mean, it wasn't like somebody else down. It just was the nature of, I think, the game more so for the defensive lineman than anything else. Just a tough spot to sort of be like, I'm taking over when, like you said, the pocket's moving constantly. Long mesh concepts and read option plays. It's just not a game for that.
No, it's not. And again, this is another one of those where we talked about, all off season, a lot of new faces, new rotation. Kamara's essentially playing a new position himself. This isn't necessarily meant to fit like a glove from week 1, and that is why these 3 games have always been, sort of so valuable for Indiana. I want to finish on one last thing, and that is the other comment that really stood out to me. And I wrote about this for Saturday's paper. It's up in indystar.com/sports right now. But the other thing that really stood out to me from what Curt Cignetti kind of talked about when he was trying to go through this sort of like, well, we did a lot of good and a lot of this was good, and the overall performance wasn't acceptable, but we're not going to lose sight of what went well and what we can build on. He said it's good we've gotten to a place where people expect us to win and where people expect us to win a certain way. And you think about, you juxtapose that to 12 months ago, where it felt like I think he had belief, I think he had buy-in, but he was still fighting, I think, even, probably even through the first few weeks of last season, for that confidence, that sort of belief in terms of, hey, this isn't just a feel-good story. We're a really good team. We are allowed to have these kinds of ambitions and these kinds of expectations because this program can live up to them. And I think he's got that now. I think that does not mean that forever and it will be that way at Indiana. But I just thought it was an interesting way to put it, an interesting way to kind of process that, because I did get a lot of, and I think even when we've, even in some of these comments we've had today, some of the comments we had on Saturday in the postgame show, were a little bit sort of like, hey, I'm just a little uneasy about what I saw out there today. And Indiana can, ultimately there's obviously a future where all these concerns manifest more greatly, and Indiana isn't the team we thought it would be, and people are allowed to be a little disappointed. But I just think it's important that Indiana's got a level of expectation around football, because that is how you change from being kind of like, if you can sustain that and you can build on that, that's how you change from being a feel-good story to a place that can actually be serious about the sport long term. And I just thought it was interesting that Cignetti that he processed it that way, essentially.
Well, an extension of that was poking fun of the crowd as well, in terms of them leaving at the half. I do think that irks him. And I do think he probably want to say a little more, but he's trying to be nice. But yeah, I mean, he wants to get to the point where football is king, and he's fighting an uphill battle just in being in terms of Indiana. But this is all part and parcel of what he's kind of come in here to do, and this has all sort of been, why he said some of the things he said last year, try to ignite the fan base. And I think he's made inroads in a team being upset that they only won by 2 touchdowns, or a fan base being upset they only won by 2 touchdowns, when it was a program desperate for just wins of any kind 2-3 years ago. Is remarkable progress. But I think he wants more, and you can see it when he talks about it. It does matter to him to try to get this thing where he envisions it.
Any other business?
Tuscaloosa North.
Tuscaloosa North. I mean, I could use the barbecue more than anything else. I could really use I could use some Alabama barbecue up here in Bloomington. There's some good spots in Bloomington, but as Mikhail Kamara and I have discussed, nothing quite like back home. So, any other business?
From Maryland and Virginia, so
but the South. He's from Virginia. I'm from Georgia. There's barbecue in Alabama. It's a holy triangle.
The holy triangle of barbecue.
Mikhail Kamara's house, my house.
I don't think
that's barbecue. Dreamland Barbecue, Big Bob Gibson's in Alabama.
Citation needed for the holy triangle of barbecue.
That'll be the new name of the podcast, the Holy Triangle of Barbecue. Discussing IU sports. All right, let's get out of here before we make even bigger fools of ourselves. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman for the Bloomington Herald-Times, for the Indianapolis Star. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Mind Your Banners for September 4th, 2025. We'll be back this weekend after IU Kennesaw State. Until then, take it easy. We'll talk to you soon.